Okay, oh, there we go. More heat, maybe. Coming online. Okay, so we all know the situation that we're talking about. We've been there many times, usually weekly. Humor gets slightly out of control and turns demeaning. And how do we respond in loving ways when that happens? It's tough to get that right, because in spite of the fact that it happens all the time, it usually catches us off guard. We're kind of flat-footed when the moment comes, and something said that just isn't quite right. And I'm envisioning often where a room gets into it, and you have to think through, what stance do I take? What do I do here? And it's not as simple as righteous indignation. So we're thinking of ways and things to do that don't necessarily make the situation worse, because it's possible to make that situation worse, just turn it into a shouting match, to turn it into indignation, to turn the person's indignation that they've been called out. That's not a great place to be either. And so we'll be looking for those kind of things. I mentioned last time, and this is important, that we're not just talking about humor, and when humor gets out of control, we're really talking about ego. Because usually when humor is out of control, ego is out of control. There's a solid connection between humor and egoism. And when humor is egoistic, it risks being out of control. There's many possibilities for humor that are not egoistic. And that's part of what we're seeking to learn here. But there's another sub-theme that I want you to keep thinking about. In the several weeks we'll be looking at this. And that is when we turn to humor in Scripture and the joy of the Lord. That we have a God who is joyful. And when we turn to the humor of Christ, then what I hope we begin to catch is maybe we don't hear Scripture. We hear Scripture, essentially this is what I'm saying. Churchgoers in most places tend to hear Scripture in one tone. Reverent. Deeply reverent. Solemn. That's good. Solemn. And so as we go through this, what I want us to be listening for, which is a big issue, how do we hear Scripture, and in what tone do we hear it? Because what I'm going to suggest is there are as many appropriate tones in Scripture as there are in life. Scripture is filled with life, and the notion of only reading it solemnly is a great disservice to the nature of God. Like, God is only solemn. God has no sense of humor. God has no sense of joy. Where did we get our joy from? Where did we get our humor from? But when we read in a tone that's always solemn, we're not doing a great service to God. But more than that, we're probably going to get our interpretation wrong. There's a number of really tough passages in Scripture. Most of us, what do they call it? Texts of terror in Scripture. Nadab and Abihu, offer unholy fire and they're struck dead. That's a text of terror. Well, I don't know what we can do with that text in terms of what I'm talking about here, but there's hard sayings of Jesus. Sometimes I think maybe the saying is hard because we assume he's scowling.
Yeah.
What if he's saying it with a grin? The same hard saying, well, you're going to have to hate your father and mother and your brother or sister. and he's sort of grinning. You know, why wouldn't that be possible?
Mhm.
You know, I mean, he's making a point. The point is still there that following him is the key to life. But we're sitting here saying, what does he mean hating? Well, yeah, because that's the tone we heard in. What does he mean hating? Well, maybe he didn't say it that way. Maybe he said that, but he didn't say it that way.
Mhm.
And I think that, you know, that's really only occurred to me recently. I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself here and say I had a little help coming to that understanding, and that is watching the TV series The Chosen. And watching the depiction of Jesus there, and suddenly you come to text and you said, never thought it could be heard that way. And, you know, because he's saying very serious things, but there's often this gentle understanding smile, the gleam in the eye, but so keep track of that one. Okay, so we talked last week about kinds of humor that are inappropriate, demeaning, and destructive, kinds of stories that are almost never funny, and we'll come back to that again later, but kind of quickly. Racial humor is not particularly funny. Ethnic humor is not particularly funny. So, well, I mean, not good and funny. I mean, it's not funny to somebody.
Mhm.
You know, sexist humor is not, is almost never funny to somebody. Religious humor, comments on people's personal appearance that are meant to be humorous are usually going to be off base. Now, the issue kind of there is, but wasn't once, not all that long ago, all of that was okay?
Mhm.
No, you've kind of heard that, and then even comedians saying, "Well, I think we were too much into PC," and you know, so, no, I think maybe we're maturing and growing up and saying, quit insulting one another that way. That we can live in a happier society if people drop these kinds of humor.
I remember as a kid, there was one like, how many men does it take to put in a light bulb?
Yeah,
You know, and it was like, in my community, why, I didn't even know what a Pollock was, but it was Pollock.
there's Pollocks.
Mhm. But I mean, I was probably third or fourth grade hearing
Yeah.
that, you know. But there's always some group that people make those kind
Yeah.
of bad jokes about.
And that's a standard joke. And the way I heard it was frogs.
Mhm.
That's a Frenchman, right?
Right.
Okay,
English, that was English Canadian pejorative for French Canadian.
okay.
Frogs. How many frogs does it take? Well, quit. You know, you're the one that looks goofy when you do that, not the French Canadians. Okay, so the point is, experiencing demeaning humor is painful. And so what we're being asked to do to begin with is empathy, at least empathizing here. Now, it doesn't help that this situation has often been depicted in movies, TV shows, and books. You know, the hero has this biting wit. They're in control of the situation. It's a measure of their superiority. And I don't know if it's changed much, but a lot of movies we watch are still 20 years old and 30 years old. And back in those movies, that's often the case. Which encourages us to be like them, to have the same control of the room, the same control of the conversation. Okay, so then we start looking at stories or teachings from the life of Jesus or other texts that show you loving ways forward in responding to humor that's out of control and is demeaning. And we start looking at various texts in scripture. And I'm going to suggest that are dealing with this issue. And I'm looking at Matthew, sections from Matthew And then Romans and then Ephesians. Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22. And you will remember these, but you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, which someone look it up, Aramaic term of contempt. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, I know what that one means, will be in danger of the fire of hell. And you read that over and you say, well, there must be something technical about that. I doubt it. And you think of the many ways we call people fools.
Those jokes we just talked about.
Oh, what?
The jokes we just talked
Yeah,
about. were
yeah.
Like basically saying, these are morons of people.
Yeah.
As a group of people, they're horrible.
And I mean, I haven't always got this right. I've used the word stupid, not of a person, but of the kind of things people do.
Mhm.
When a person who does that kind of thing is in the room,
Mhm.
And so what I'm saying is we're talking about something here that it's a challenge. It's a growth. It takes growth. It takes maturation, and it in the end it takes, I think, a certain forgiveness of yourself. I'm going to guess right now that I probably won't make it through tomorrow night without violating something that we're talking about tonight. But what I need to do with that is what is going on in me that I want to say that? Okay, so that's one text in Matthew that I think is fairly clear. On Sunday, Sermon on the Mount again, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. We've looked at in Sunday morning in some detail lately. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And we've, a lot of humor has a substantial element of judgment in it to put down. So that I'm gonna say we've done due diligence on Sunday morning and keep moving. The Matthew chapter 12, verses 33 to 37. Make a tree good and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. But I tell you that men will have to give an account in the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. And that's what we're talking about here.
And that's why Sandy's so quiet. She doesn't want to be condemned. In your words.
Huh.
Mhm.
I was thinking here, I think we all have a problem with these issues, and then, well, maybe not Sandy, who I really don't hear in the end, well, a few unkind things. But I have never heard, I don't know a person that in the end Sandy doesn't have a high regard for, which is admirable. Good going. Yeah. Okay,
Dale,
yeah,
I'm just thinking out loud that, we're talking about humor, but in my mind, the kind of humor we're talking about is really, it's a disguise for taking a power position over someone else. And
yes.
I'm reminded I did that really literally, and I'll never forget it. Must have been eighth grade. There was this, first of all, I was a scrawny kid, constantly made fun of. And so I was always in not the power position, but I found myself in gym class, and there was this gigantic kid named Max Crouch who had fallen down when playing football, not football, basketball. And I found myself standing over him with the basketball. So he's laying on the floor looking up at me. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny to drop the basketball on his face? It was an awful thing to do.
I'm not supposed
It
to.
wasn't a bit funny. It was disguised as humor,
Mhm.
but it was an awful thing to do. Scrawny guy drops a basketball on the face of giant Max Crouch. Now, by the way, Max Crouch never made fun of me. He had his own problems. But here, I took advantage of that power position over him, and I wielded it ruthlessly.
You did it?
Yeah, I did.
Now you know why I didn't date John in school.
Yeah. Well, but I think that's the way a lot of people
Yeah.
use humor. And they find themselves hurting other people, or they realize what they said was hurtful, but because people giggled, it sort of forgave it, or it cloaked it in that giggle.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, John, that for the honesty.
I'll get a letter from you guys this week saying, all right, that's okay.
I think you've paid your dues.
Hopefully.
Okay, Romans chapter 12, verse 3. We're just looking at a few tonight because when you start thinking about it, scripture comes back to this theme in many, many ways. Romans chapter 12, verse 3, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in according with the measure of faith God has given you. And then in Ephesians, this is a critical text. He comes up with a critical phrase that I think we aspire to here. Ephesians 4, verses 14 to 16. It's a loaded text. It would bear some careful interpretation and thought. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself in love as each part does its work. It's that concept, speaking the truth in love, which is what we aspire to. It's an interesting text, which over the years I've learned to interpret in ways very differently than I was first taught. That beginning part, then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. I learned that that was anything that you might be saying that I didn't already believe. You know, that, or those groups, our group has the truth. And you don't want to be blown aside by those other groups with their bad doctrine. I look at it now and say, I think it's equally that we will no longer be childish, tossed back and forth by every wind of teaching. But that's not where we're going to get caught up. You're going to hear things you don't agree with. You're going to find loving ways to respond to it. Speaking the truth in love. And then it goes on and says, and talks about the group itself is built up with what? Builds itself up in what? In love. And that's fundamental. But I mean, you think about it, isn't that church history? Blown to and fro by every wind of doctrine. I mean, they're always going to be there. Don't let them blow you to and fro. It's not like you can get rid of them. You follow what I'm saying there? But that's not, don't let that throw you off. The fact that someone sees it differently, well, great, they might be right. Well, the fact that someone sees it wrong, well, they might see it wrong. You know, but don't get blown off course by that. And don't get agitated. Don't lose your love.
Mhm.
You know, you're supposed to love. And yeah. So, and then in Ephesians, because Paul is really coming at this one in verse 29 of chapter 4, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. The powerful, you know, what should come out of your mouth, only what's helpful for building others up. Guess what? I'm not going to get that in the next 10 minutes, you know, but that's what I have to keep aspiring to. That's what I'm meant to grow toward. And then let's see, chapter 5, verse 4, just over the chapter division, where he says, but among verse 3, but among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality, any kind of impurity or of greed. These are improper for God's holy people. But then, nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. The coarse joking catches your attention, because a lot of when humor gets out of control and is demeaning, coarse joking is a pretty good description of what can be going on.
Locker room talk.
Oh, what?
Locker room talk.
Locker room talk, that's what your wife said, locker room
Is that
talk.
what that's called?
The
Women have locker rooms too.
I know, but I didn't even ask my
Okay, we'll look at some of the other texts each week. We'll look at a few more. What I want to talk about for a little bit is a section I'm calling almost like an appendix in the middle of all of this, is the joy of the Lord. And the truth is that that we worship a fabulously joyful God. Do you remember what Abraham named his boy? Isaac, which means he laughs. Because as Sarah, now a mother in her old age, said, God has brought me laughter. And so we hear the texts of terror in Scripture, the stories of the flood, of Nadab and Abihu, Uzzah touching the Ark of the Covenant and being struck dead. But what about the other stories? The stories of an exuberantly joyful God. What are we to think of a God who creates the universe out of nothing? I mean, just think of try your best to picture that, which you can't, but that's joyful. You know, that's the epitome of joy. You know, and especially as you hear the story in Genesis 1, what did he have? He had nothing, and he made this. And the tone there is laughter. I mean, this is what our God did out of nothing. He did this. Designs the pleasure garden of Eden. What does he do at the very beginning? He creates a pleasure garden. He takes a slave people in Egypt and makes from them a great nation. I'm being asked for his name. This is Moses before the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. Moses asks for his name, and what does God say?
I am.
I am.
I am.
I am, I will be.
Yeah, I am. but, you know, that's kind of funny. If you think about it, I mean,
You think that's funny? He made baby goats.
he what?
He made baby goats. You ever been around a baby goat?
Yeah.
They're hilarious.
Exactly. He stops the sun for Joshua. In Joshua, the 10th chapter, in a battle that they're winning, and they need a little more time to solidify the victory. And so Joshua asks for the sun to stop. And as the story goes, it does. Now, people spend all sorts of time trying to find that day and time that, you know, because we can do that now. We can go in, but we can't quite find it. Let's, you know, get a grip, everybody. I mean, this is a campfire story. Or something like it. I mean, a lot of these stories, especially in the Old Testament, are you know, they're not written in the Age of Enlightenment. They're not written with our notions of historical narrative. They're not written with our notions of scientific analysis. They're stories that we all kind of know this, that they all began, most of them began with oral tradition. They were first told orally. They weren't written at all. But I want you to picture that sometimes it's just a story told around the campfire. And you know what God did? He gave them that time. Well, I don't know. You know, it's a campfire story. It's just funny. I mean, and you know, catch the humor there. He gives Gideon and his band of 300 victory over hundreds of thousands. Funny. I mean, I'm saying they weren't counting the people there. They're just telling a story of against incredible odds. They
So
won.
basically saying like hyperbole is a feature of much humor. So when we see a lot of hyperbole, you might say that it possibly was humorous.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, this is the way in the ancient Near East these kind of stories were told. They weren't taking a census like we would, or maybe it wasn't a list of casualties at the end of it. They weren't doing that. They're just saying, give God 300 and he can wipe out tens of thousands if that's what he needs to do. Sort of the strong sons of Jesse, through the prophet Samuel, God chooses the youngest one to be king of the people. Now, here's a story that you know, you may have read sometime, but this is the last one of these we're going to look at tonight. 2 Kings chapter 6. Find your way to 2 Kings chapter 6. Kings. 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 to 23. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. And conferring with his officers, he said, I will set my camp in such and such a place. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. Now, catch the way this story is first told and the joy Israel will get. The original readers of the story, the original listeners of the story. This enraged the king of Aram. Every time I set up camp, they know where I am. You know, what's going on? This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? None of us, my lord the king, said one of the officers, but Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel. tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. Pretty funny. Go find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he is in Dothan. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. Now you want to picture this. Horses, chariots, a strong force. Wake up in the morning when the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning. An army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh, my Lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, O Lord, open his eyes so that he may see. And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots all around Elisha. Now, go figure what is going on in that story, but one thing that's going on is a real sense of confidence and a real sense of humor. I mean, joy. I mean, and you know, you can even picture that in your life today, that you know, that you're dealing with tough things, and say, open your eyes to the hills and see what else is going on. I mean, there's more going on here than what you first see, and the hills are full of horses and chariots of fire. And okay, is there anything mythological about that? Maybe. There's no problem with myths in scripture. Robert, you and I were talking about this Friday night. And it's no surprise, you know, when people say that there are myths in scripture. The problem is when they say they're just myths. Myths are filled with truth.
Yes, they are.
They're filled with truth. The problem is when Richard Dawkins or somebody says, well, it's just myths. You know, because myths are the way the ancient people told their truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the way we tell our truth too.
And retain them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and retain it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and we are modern people and we still use myths.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, if you just read this story on its mirrors and say, opens his servant's eyes and he looks and wow, as the enemy came down toward him, Elijah prayed to the Lord, strike these people with blindness. And so he struck them with blindness. Now, keep picturing it, you know. The Aramean army comes marching down and suddenly they can't see where they're going. I mean, you know, don't just read the text on the page, picture the scene. So he struck them with blindness, as Elisha had asked. The joyful God we have. Elisha told them, this is not the road and this is not the city. Follow me and I will lead you to the man you are looking for. And he led them to Samaria, which is the capital city, well fortified and so on. After they entered the city, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men so that they can see. Then the Lord opened their eyes and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. I mean, what a bad day for the Arameans, right? When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill him, my father? Shall I kill him? Do not kill him, Elisha answered. Would you kill men you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their masters. So he prepared a great feast for them. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away and they returned to their masters. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory.
Why haven't we told this in Sunday school? We never once have I seen this as a story that.
And it's all about peace, right?
Yeah.
And he leads them in to the city, you know, where they're at the mercy now of the Israelites, and the prophet says,
Feed them,
set a feast for them. But what I also want you to capture in stories like this is a story I picture that was first told around a campfire.
Mhm.
And they had a lot of fun.
Mhm.
That's the point I'm making. You work out what's
Mhm.
mythological, what's not mythological, what actually happened here. Do whatever you want with that, but just listen to how the story is first told, and it's fun.
I'm sure I've read this before, but it felt like I was reading it for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the other, what I'm suggesting here is a whole lot of texts, a whole lot of statements, a whole lot of sayings you will hear for the first time if you pick some tone other than solemn. Suddenly it will be new. Now there are solemn texts in scripture, right? There are quite a few of them, but it's not the only tone. That's what I'm driving at. Okay, we're going to come back and look at a little more of that next week, but I'm going to move on to the humor of Christ. And I've already said this, but what's really helped me in understanding the humor of Christ is the TV series The Chosen. And you know how a series has its lead-in music, and after you're into the fourth episode and you're given the option to skip the intro and you do, because you've heard that like every time. Okay. This is the lead into The Chosen, and I never missed it once. I wanted to hear it every time. Oh, child, come on in, jump in the water. Got no trouble with the mess you've been. Walk on the water. And that's essentially Jesus saying, got no trouble with the mess you've been, because you know what? You've been a mess. You've been a mess. I've been a mess. Got no trouble with the mess you've been. And he doesn't mean by that keep being, he's just saying that doesn't stand between you and me. You've all been messes. We've all been messes. Got no trouble with the mess you've been. And the music is also very good, but I'd come close to daring to sing it, but I won't. Spare you. Okay, now here's the question. I'm on page 5. Why is it that within church circles, the humor of Jesus is so often missed or ignored? And while you're thinking about that, how many of you, it was turned into a movie, get the author's name, Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. It's about a medieval monastery and a death in a medieval monastery in the scriptorium. And the issue is some monk has dared to write that Jesus could be fun. And that was like completely irreverent.
Right.
And it's a great book, but what it captures is that has often been the way it's been looked at. So what is it within church circles, or why is it that the humor of Jesus is so often missed or ignored? Well, one tone.
Mhm. Well, language interpretation makes it difficult. Translations, and just not just, but just that's in itself is a barrier.
Yeah. Okay. For our purposes tonight, for our purposes tonight, go to Matthew 23. That is exactly right. Matthew 23, the series of denunciations against the Pharisees, teachers of the law and the Pharisees. But what he finally comes down to, and he says, you give 1/10 of your spices, but you neglect the more important matters of the law, you blind guides. Verse 24, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Okay, now you're supposed to see that. You're not just supposed to read it. You're supposed to see a person trying to get, trying to strain out a gnat, but having no problem, but trying to swallow a camel. The camels camels are almost always going to be humorous, that a rich man can't get to heaven, the likelihood of that happening, the difficulty is like a camel going through the eye of a needle. And we come up with, well, the eye of the needle was a little door inside the larger doors. No, the eye of the needle was the eye of a needle. This is very visual humor, and you're meant to see how absurd this is.
To me,
The
Children get it.
as a
Yeah.
cartoon,
Yeah,
not, a live thing, but a print cartoon, which you can kind of then do something extraordinary with.
who did we cut
That
off?
was Rosemary.
Rosemary.
I said that children get the humor in these
Yeah.
stories. We just did the do not judge scripture with the log and the speck and
Right.
we made sawdust in church and we watched a cartoon and the kids were cracking up, the guy with the log sticking out of his eye.
Yeah.
It's funny.
It is, and you're absolutely right. Children aren't going to miss that. Adults are sober.
I remember reading Elton Trueblood's
Yeah.
The Humor of Christ,
Yeah,
and I struggled through it
because
because it wasn't funny. I had a tough time. I'm glad I went through it, but because I think I've laughed more tonight than I laughed with Elton Trueblood's book.
Yeah.
I think it's a good book, but I wish I could have seen what I've seen tonight. I didn't
Yeah.
see it then.
yeah, that was in the 1960s. I don't think I've ever read it, but in preparing for this class, the book gets referenced
Yeah.
over and over again. And we're going to look at some other examples next week. But the one we just looked at of the Pharisees, you strain at a gnat, but swallow a camel. Now imagine, catch this. In Aramaic, the word for gnat is galma. And the word for camel is gamla.
Yeah.
Jesus is making a play on words that adds to the humor of the whole situation.
Mhm.
But how we miss that. So one of the reasons we're going to miss that, in addition to being told you must always be straight and serious every time you look at something spiritual, the reason we miss that is that's Aramaic translated into Greek, translated into English. By the time it makes it in English from the Greek and from the Aramaic, you miss a lot of things of that kind of thing. You're going to miss the word plays. There's that way you strain at a galma and you swallow a gamla.
Yeah, you can't translate a pun too well.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's another one is Catholic, when that's how I was raised. You couldn't chew gum in church.
yeah, in a church in which
Don't chew gum. No, it's a no.
yeah. So humor isn't going to be well rewarded either.
No. So I'm just referring back to why is it that within church, the humor of Jesus is so often missed or ignored? Because I guess a lot of people think you're in church, so you have to be straight and narrow.
Yeah, yeah.
Could it be that humor and imagination sort of go together? And it's pretty convenient that when we go to church, we don't use our imagination. We just accept, right? Or we say, okay, yeah, whatever you're preaching. But if we applied our imagination, we could probably see God in so many other ways.
Yeah.
So many other ways.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of creativity in scripture. You're meant to read it with a certain amount of creativity.
I think I threw a gnat into the discussion here. Sorry about that.
No. I mean, if anything, I'm getting to the end of my race of teaching this evening, and the finish line is just off there, and I'm running out of
Run, Forrest, run.
Go, baby, go.
Okay, so on page 6, we'll come back to this next week. But if you have a comment tonight, we've got a bit of time to think through again, and if you will, share experiences when you have seen humor out of control happen, and when it's turned demeaning and destructive, when you see those who are being demeaned under the guise of humor. And what insights might you offer for responding to such experiences lovingly and constructively, so as not to do more harm than good? What lessons have you learned? I could think of a couple. We'll come back here because this is a key question for the whole unit. And the person in front of me has just said an outrageous thing about a group of people. It may be something that I have laughed at in the past myself. And suddenly I've become enlightened, and I know that was inappropriate. But everyone's laughing. And the one thought that occurs to me is if I have a problem with that person, it's probably a whole lot better to go to them one-on-one later than to confront it at that point in time. At that point in time, you will create the kind, I'm just thinking my way through this, but at that point in time, you'll just create defensiveness, and they will probably entrench themselves even deeper in their frustration with this group of people. But you go to them and say, listen, when that was said, I almost laughed myself, but I really kind of have this is how it made me feel. That's another thing that, this isn't what I language, not you language. We're not going to talk about what you did wrong. I'm going to talk about how I felt when you did that. What I'm trying to do is pull their resistance down so they can see the truth too. And in as non-accusatory way as I can. Other thoughts tonight?
Like I said someone said last week, just kind of letting something, I think it was Kathy, just kind of letting it drop, just kind of like that sometimes is not, all right, you just kind of like maybe put a little question mark on your face, like, what?
That's what your expression is. It's good. You don't have to say anything. Have to say a word. Since we want to come. Before you go on, I used to tell a story that JG actually assigned to me called Cindy Ellie. It's sort of a Black version of the Cinderella story. Remember? And so I said it in Darien, Connecticut. Somebody's trying to bring in at nearly 8 o'clock. And I said the story in Darien, Connecticut, where Cindy's little Ella is this little Black girl, and her mother dies. And I described the funeral of this little girl's mother. And I said it was in the biggest Black Baptist church in Darien, Connecticut. So when I tell that story here, people they roll in laughter because there are very few Black people live in Darien.
There's certainly no big Black.
And then I add, it's catty-corner from the synagogue, in Darien, okay?
Yeah.
After I told that story, a man came up to me and said, you know what, I laughed at that, and then it hit me that there are no Black churches in Darien. There are no Black people. And then it hit him that humor got to him in the fact that, Darien is a very white community.
No Jewish synagogue.
No Jewish synagogues and stuff like that. And so he got the gravity of, Darien demographic or
Mhm.
lack thereof
Mhm.
of diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was pretty powerful.
Mhm.
Okay, any final comment tonight? Anything you're wondering about? Anything that maybe needs elaboration, or what in the world did you mean when you said that? Well, another first-rate job
Okay.
of teaching.
We just-
No,
I-
no, Penny, what, was you,
May have been Robert.
She's muted. Penny is muted.
Kenny, we can't hear you.
No, it wasn't me. I was saying Robert, but
Oh,
okay, Robert.
Robert,
The man behind the curtain.
but we don't, before everybody gets off, I did hear from Lorraine just now, and she's had a pretty rough day. Yes, she had the chemo yesterday and pretty rough day today with nausea. And something that gave her something called a cold cap that's supposed to help with not losing your hair, but she said it gave her a wretched headache, and she doesn't think she'll do that anymore.
Yeah, that's a rough thing. I've heard.
Yeah, so she's.
You put ice all in your, in this
Yeah.
thing on top of your head and you have to keep filling it all the time.
Yeah, she
It's
said it was terrible,
painful.
and she said she
Yeah.
probably wouldn't do it again, so.
Won't do that part of it
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, if you, we'll let her know we are praying for her, so.
Okay.
Yeah, usually it kind of builds up